I think that just as we're living in a nuclear age, we have grown so tremendously in scientific knowledge, it doesn't seem too much to say that men can begin to awaken to the fact that they haven't grown enough spiritually and haven't recognized their spiritual capacities.
Once something like eating is death, then you've struck at the very heart of life. The enemy of the older radical theories may have been the ruling class, but today the stakes of whether we will reform ourselves into a new kind of human being, a new kind of society, whether we will find selves worth being, the stakes of it are simply life itself.
Modernity has created promises that it has no ability to keep. What this means is that we're a society of disembedded individuals, stuck in the impossible situation of being alone together. And what was understood as emancipation has proved to be a form of isolation. It is important to understand that what I am telling you is not simply a cultural history. It's a description of the story that shapes every single person that you know. This is why there is a rise in mental illness. It's absolutely concurrent with the disembedding of the individual, because individuals can't constitute themselves by the very nature of the case. Subjectivity cannot sustain its own weight. We need others to tell us. But we've been given an ethical mandate by the Enlightenment that tells us that that's immoral, that nobody should constrain us.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's not pleasant to contemplate to what extent you're a useful idiot in the schemes of powerful forces.
No, it's not. And I mean, stuff like that is seen better in hindsight, but even now, if you point it out, most people aren't going to be able to get that.
Yeah. Well, think of the comment of that agricultural dean in that class you and Jacob are doing. When you were saying things like this, he's like, I don't know about farmers that are going out of business. I just know about farmers that are retiring and none of their kids want the farm, so it just goes on the market. And what's the problem with that?
I know, that was just one of those moments where you're like, my dear, you're so nice. You're so nice. Well, I don't know what.
But he's not wrong to be saying on the surface of things, there are just people making choices on a market. He's not wrong as far as it goes. It just doesn't go very far.
They're technically making choices. But the truth is, for instance, like, they can't afford to stay in this business. They realize that they're being outcompeted by farms with more land and much more expensive equipment, and they'd have to go into massive debt to try to keep up, and it's this huge gamble. And they can't even like have their kids stay on the farm because the small profit margin they have will not like allow for more than one kid, for instance, to run the farm. And so on. So yeah, they technically have a choice, but in reality, they don't. And of course, they're not going to choose to go bankrupt and file bankruptcy, because I remember that's what that guy said was, well, I don't know anybody who actually like became bankrupt in my, rural county or whatever. Well, most people don't want to get to the point where they're going to declare bankruptcy. They just decide that maybe they need to retire and get out of this or sell their land to some bigger operation so that they can avoid bankruptcy. And this is, it's not even a dispute. This is what has happened for decades. That's why we have such consolidation of land. It's not that, farmer wakes up and says, oh, I don't think I want to do this anymore. I'm going to sell my land. I mean, most of these people they really like their way of life. They don't want to let it go, but they don't feel like they have a choice. That's kind of like I was going to say like what we talked to Nick about with people that were like selling out to the fracking industry. But I did want to mention that, after we talked to Bryant about the Dust Bowl phenomenon, we also talked about ecological and political futures. And that one, I would say, go back and listen to that one, people, because there were some wild ideas flying around there. I'd love to have Bryant back to talk even more about futuring, but I mean, we ranged all over the place. But I do remember Bryant at one point referencing the dolphin people from Guillaume Fay's archaeofuturism. So, but I mean, a lot of that discussion centered on we all agree climate change is real. We're getting into the danger zone. Probably at this point, there's no turning back to us. Like we've gone past the point where if we cut emissions drastically, that we can kind of halt things. It's a matter of, can we still do that so that it's not as bad as it would otherwise be? And, I think we talked about that APSR article. He's the first author that I've ever seen in that journal that actually mused about whether authoritarian governments might be necessary in order to deal with all of the crises that will come from climate change, from, like crop failure to floods to, famines to mass migration. And may this not be an inevitability. Guillaume Fay, I mean, it's interesting. There's quite a bit of overlap there. Fay basically argues from an ethno-nationalist perspective, but still like that, in the wake of a climate catastrophe, there will be plenty of pockets of sort of tribal or, national, small, like groupings that return to a kind of archaic state. All sorts of stuff, that is scary and not optimal, and yet realistically those are possibilities. So,
and that's what happens when you lose ideas like that, either small determined minorities or a more majoritarian force in society could forge a revolutionary subject.
Well, if people wonder why both of us tend to lean Christian, and maybe Catholic Christian in particular, over the course of time, it shouldn't be too much of a surprise, because when you think about all the options for trying to bring some sort of unity and a higher focus or a higher level of thinking than just looking out for number one, there's not a lot of options lying around that seem terribly plausible. And so hopefully, also we'll kind of make it clear over time we made those decisions. I mean, maybe like personally, as well as, as far as this podcast goes, of just how seriously to take the Christian angle. But before we maybe talk about that a little bit more, just to mention, like our last two episodes, which are probably fresher in people's mind, we had to do with fracking, and we talked to Nick Gaffron, first about his battle with fighting fracking in Pennsylvania, where we learned that very well-meaning liberal progressive people got involved in fighting against fracking, which can greatly disrupt your property and your peace of mind and your environment. But when it came right down to it, none of them actually followed through. And so he started to express frustration about, we would call a meeting and everybody just wanted to do whatever the hell what was it? They were like making floats for a parade and trying to figure out what logos to put on their t-shirts and stuff like that. And gosh, the fracking companies had already won the battle before they even like put the float together.
Right.
Yeah. So our last episode was on kind of why all of us, we mused about, why is it that it's so hard for even like-minded people who say that they really care to actually cooperate with each other and do something meaningful? I guess both of us are kind of tormented by that question, aren't we?
Mm-hmm. I am.
Yeah, it's pretty hard. I mean, and to try to discern who is actually serious and who is not easy. I haven't been able to come up with a formula for that. But Nick couldn't even get people to go to a city commission meeting. We're not talking about major commitment like change your way of life. We're just talking about,
or using your money to make friends.
Yeah, we're not even talking that. We're just saying, can you get up off the couch for an hour to go to a city commission meeting and stand there? now that we've kind of reviewed what we did, I guess it's time to kind of talk about where we are headed and maybe why. All right. Well, I mean, so I think next are going to interview a pastor by the name of Tom Mundell. He's a Lutheran pastor who's dedicated a lot of his life to educating Christians on environmental concerns. He has a MDiv at Luther Seminary in St. Paul, and he's worked at churches as a pastor as well as in campus ministry. And he has actually run at a certain point in his career a Catholic worker house when he was a campus pastor at the University of Iowa. Among the things that I've learned from Tom from talking to him is that Catholic worker house didn't outlast his involvement as the campus pastor there. So I know that we want to talk about that, as well as his experience actually trying to interest Christians in environmental concerns and getting them to educate themselves about that. So we'll probably have one, if not two episodes with Tom, because I'm really interested in, like applying the problem that we kind of began to explore through Nick, specifically to Christians.
I mean, I feel part of the underlying structure of this first season, we've been talking basically about secular topics. Like religion hasn't really, I mean, we talked about it with the spoils of Egypt in like our first interview, but I think we're both in agreement that we'd like to explore religious perspectives and answers to these things, in part because we've despaired of secular answers.
You and I have read an awful lot and discussed an awful lot of theology, basically related to, not just related to the environment, but definitely relatable to the environment. And so one thing that we may do is bring some of that most important, the stuff that we consider most important, into discussion. Both Protestant as well as Catholic. I mean, when I think back on what we've read, an awful lot of what we've read and discussed together is actually Protestant in origin, because there's a lot of good stuff to be had out there. Like Walter Brueggemann, right? Like was a huge deal for. There's like competing views of what the meaning of Christ's coming to earth, the incarnation, and the crucifixion, and how that relates to how we view each other and our environment.
I would think it would boil down to a similar question of, can you see the disjunct between how we use money versus how we should use money? I feel like there's a similar issue about like children of light being stupid in the world, like both with how capitalism functions and how ecology actually functions, And I think a big buttress they have up is a belief that, well, God is in control, so it doesn't really matter what I do, or it doesn't matter what my society has been doing for hundreds of years.
Right. Yeah. There's like, and I'm grossly simplifying, but in this regard, there's two schools of thought, one of which is that, Christ came to kind of save us from eternal damnation, and he paid the ultimate price by kind of taking the punishment that we were supposed to receive and sort of becoming that ultimate sacrifice of us, like the substitution for the old time sacrifices of animal sacrifices was Christ, who pays the ultimate price and then gives us, if we believe in him, this pass to go to heaven. So that's one school of thought, and its ramifications are pretty deep for how we view our relationship to each other as well as the environment, because you're much more likely, if the focus is, you have to remain faithful, or you have to accept Christ and look forward to the afterlife, it probably means that you're not going to really value too much the world, the environment, this life. It's not as crucial what you do here. And eventually this world is going to be from this perspective tends to be that the world is going to be destroyed with the second coming of Christ, right? So that can lead to a kind of indifference or even kind of negative charge towards the environment.
Absolutely. And I mean, what always got me growing up, in like a religious area of the country, or an allegedly religious, is it would be one thing if these people said, okay, well, let's be relatively ascetic and let's curb our appetites and our consumption and live humble lives, desperately trying to become saints. But that's not what people do. That view of, well, none of this matters because it's going to be used up, coexists with just being rapacious consumers,
right?
In a way that I don't understand how these people sleep at night.
Well, it's almost like, party. What is that song? Like it's 1999 or something like that. Like if
Party like it's 1999.
Yeah, that whole thing, right? If things are going to, if ultimately the world is consumable, because ultimately the world does not matter because it's going to be destroyed. And it's just kind of a veil of tears where we have to be, but when we die, we're going to go straight to heaven. So it doesn't really matter. Then why not? As long as in your like mind, and this is where you're probably having heartburn because I guess it's just not true. But like in your mind, if you can consume all those things while not sinning, because maybe sin to you just means sexual sin or lying or something like that, and you don't think of like rapaciously using resources that other people could use.
Sure.
And,
which how you would it's so abstract and impersonal and dependent on like global supply chains. We don't see it in the same way that we can imagine like murder being wrong.
The second way of, and it's also a big gloss, so pardon me for doing this, but if you see the incarnation as Jesus, again, he's healing the rift, but he does it through his incarnation in melding his godly DNA, let's say, with human DNA in Mary, and through, being man and God, he sanctifies the world and displays God's attitude towards the world as good, else he would not have come into it in this way, right? Making it, the lesson being that it is important and worthy of care, nor would he have incarnated and spent his time teaching people to be a certain way if none of that really mattered. And it was just a matter of believing on him that mattered.
Right. One of the things that came to mind was there's an old Thomistic formulation that says that grace perfects nature, and grace being like God's, divine power to fulfill things and heal things. That wasn't a great definition, but I think it works. In that first view you were looking at about, well, God's going to come, it doesn't really matter what we do, which is it's like a Christian nihilism, or like a pseudo Christian nihilism. Like if you were to transpose that into that steward story we were talking about, it would be Jesus saying, well, just throw your money away or just burn it or have fun, because like I'm going to make a new world anyway and we're going to party.
Yeah.
Or put another way, it's like grace just sort of destroys and recreates nature in a way, instead of, no, like nature is already good and to be preserved to the extent we can, and then like fulfilled.
If Mary, a human being, was a worthy home for God, then you can't treat other people with this impunity or disregard. And if God came into the world and walked here, then the world is worth something. And I'm not saying that this is the only reason why a Christian should care about the environment, but it's a major one. Likewise, the idea of the crucifixion in the second view changes from just being substitutionary atonement sacrifice for you to enter heaven to the ultimate kind of melding of God's suffering with human suffering. The ultimate sympathy, the ultimate melding of man and God happens there as well. And that side is, the blessing even of our suffering. you know, the full human experience, even the ugliest part, is worthy of God's love. And God loved human beings so much that he actually shared all of that with us and didn't hold anything back. This is where I think of that Harwas piece that we recently read, one from Plow magazine called The Good Life, If Liberalism Failed to Deliver What We Can. And one of the things that he mentions in here is that, you know, what is missing in our way of life is that we have like tried to escape suffering so much, and of course you can't anyway, but we haven't focused on having a life worth living, right? Which is different from escaping suffering or somehow, you know, avoiding thinking about death, never having pain.
No, and I think it's part of our human nature is, and that's constantly frustrated in our society, is a personalist and communitarian and probably communist drive towards connection with other people and with creation and with God. And under modernity, and especially under capitalism, there's no way to, we can have platitudes about it, but it's not, we're haunted by these dreams of if only we could treat human beings like human beings. But that would require amount of care for each other and a struggle against the abstract and evil forces that dominate us, that, you know, we can't bring ourselves to it, I don't think.
And your point is, you know, it's easier for people to think about starting that press or like, you know, printing a magazine or whatever, or doing something like that that's very partial,
Right.
as an expression of your aspirations, but without having to do battle, basically.
And even starting that press is heroic. Most people, it's just, you know, whatever conservative pundit owns trans activist. And you just go down this rabbit trail on YouTube and you feel like you're like somehow or other like repairing the cosmos.
Right, right. So when what you're talking about is literally what some people, maybe somewhat tritely, but still people will recognize this, they refer to as the God-shaped hole, right? Like,
sure,
really the aspiration is for something much more meaningful and better that does involve loving, you know, God as well as other human beings, and a far greater sense of belonging. And we all kind of, or at least most people probably deep down want that, but it seems impossible, or the price that would have to be paid is so high relative to our current, I don't know, like it just seems to be easier in any given moment for people to operate as individuals with mainly self-interest.
and there's no like social infrastructure to support us actually taking care of each other and not only being supernaturally happy, but even naturally happy. Like Howard Ross talks about that shepherd at the beginning of that article, that there is a kind of natural happiness that I think you would still probably feel a lack, but people are denied even natural happiness, even like the comforts of stable family, just as one example.
Well, right. Yeah. If you're living a fairly stable life and you feel like you're doing something like that shepherd was doing that is useful, and you have this rhythm and you have relationships, you have a lot of the ingredients, not only for a sort of natural happiness, but also for a greater chance of connecting with God, I think, because for one thing, he's paying attention to the natural cycles of the world. So, I mean, right there, it's very difficult to like totally forget that there's something bigger going on in life if you are like witnessing nature more. And then, you know, when you're more focused on your personal relationships and on taking care of something that you have expertise in, right, that you have to kind of like work with. Nature is not like ultra pliable, like it has its limits, and so you have to kind of cooperate with it and with other people in that type of setting. So I would think that it would be easier for a person to kind of gain the spiritual depth necessary to maybe become closer to God almost naturally. And most of us are missing that opportunity, you know, because we haven't lived in the same place for a long time. Many of us have very abstract jobs that we spend most of our time doing. Then you go and you consume something in order to try to gain what you feel you're lacking. And it's
Mhm.
always at a price, whether it's lots of times it's a money price.
Sure. Or if it's free, it's because you're probably the product.
It's hard for people to even believe that it might not cost anything, right? To gain more satisfaction. Sometimes I think it just comes at the price of deciding you're going to settle down on a particular thing, even if it's not your ideal way of life. In my case right now, I have a 95-year-old dad living next door to me, and I am dedicated to helping make the rest of his life as good as it can be. So I see him every day. He comes with me now when I do some things. And if he has a problem, I'm going to be there for him. And I'm not ultimately free to do any and everything I want to do. But as I've kind of settled into that commitment to my parents, but now my dad, there is doing something like that does allow you to think about what is the bigger meaning of life.
But it's hard for people to swallow the sacrifices needed.
Well, and I would say you've kind of done the same thing there in Kansas City by staying where you're at, even though you've gone through multiple changes in plan due to the fact that you can't get a whole lot of cooperation going on. But so far you've stayed there.
Well, and it takes a lot of anxieties off the table. I think a lot of people, they have the fear of missing out or whatever. They're spending all their time on screens, seeing fabulous people doing fabulous things. And therefore they're in the abstract, their possibilities are endless, but their like actual reality is like mostly void. Whereas I'm to some degree on the other side of it, where I'm doing things. Life is enough of an adventure, even if it's not sort of like a fun movie ready adventure, that I don't feel this lack that I need to make up for by like partying all weekend.
Neither do I. I went through that period and got over it, because really it doesn't amount to anything. And there's really nothing that you take away from that. So you have to keep repeating that. Not that I never like party at all, but I actually haven't done like any major partying in maybe like 3 or 4 years. But part of the reason for that is COVID. But yeah. But I'm sure like to some people listening to this, it sounds boring and restrictive.
Sure.
And
compared to what?
Yeah, exactly. Compared to what, right? So I'm okay with that, but that might be yet another thing for us to kind of unpack a little bit more over time, is both of our experience and how we got to the point where we are now. People don't necessarily know a lot about that one way or the other, and it's probably relevant. But then, I think we wanted to maybe move into more singularly Catholic social thought, perhaps. That's a ways out, so I don't know, we could always change our minds, but Catholic social teaching is, I think, important to both of us, and probably the reason both of us are Catholics at this point. Or at least probably one of the reasons anyway. Like Laudato Si would be a no-brainer to discuss with people.